So I skipped ahead there, but we're just gonna go right back. So, as I said, today's talk is called Awaken to a New Reality of Religious Freedom. Our lives depend on it. And so, as I prepared for tonight's event, my mind could not stop thinking about the imagery and the news stories that filled my social media timeline. And I will show you one of them that you might be familiar with here. I'm going to skip through that and I will come back to sharing this. This image here, this is one that we've all seen. We saw this in the public square happening here in our nation's capital on January 6th. It was the insurrection that took place at the U.S. Capitol building. And when I see this image, I often think and raise the question, how did this have impact on people of color, religious minorities, non-religious individuals? What about immigrants? Like, what about those that are seeking to come to the United States to escape the atrocities of where they might be from? I also thought about the imagery that has filled my social media timeline in the most recent days. That is the awareness of the lived experiences of Black and Brown people in this country at the expense of what some might call white rage or white fragility. I struggled, and I'll stop sharing this image, but I want you to think about this image as we talk tonight. I struggled with watching the clips of Kyle Rittenhouse trial because of a deep emotion that stirred memories of the tragic loss of life in the name of self-defense and false convictions. It is a story that Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, Emmett Till, and others like George Junius Stinney Jr. faced. He was a 14-year-old Black boy who was falsely convicted of murdering 2 white girls in South Carolina. He was executed in 1944 as the youngest person in the United States to be executed. But he was exonerated in 2015 for having an unfair trial, 70 years later. Or to bring it to this present moment of time, as Julius Jones in Oklahoma faces a pending execution date 1 week from today, although the parole board has evidence of his innocence. When I think about these images that I've seen, and I think about history of a people, of peoples, of nations, indigenous nations, we have to talk about the realities of our country. So it is written with these words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and I'm gonna add women, are created equal, but they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. These are very powerful words that were written in the Declaration of Independence. They exhort ideas that often go unrealized for many African Americans and people of color in the United States. Whereas many Americans embrace the practices of religious freedom and celebrate diversity, too often racial and religious minority groups continue to be negatively impacted by social perceptions and public policies, which are constructed as an assault on their identities. Paramount to what is perceived to be a post-racial and pluralistic society, African Americans of all religious identities and none continue to struggle with the realities and historical implications of racial, social, and economic disparities, which are systematically symptomatic of America's flawed foundation. Former presidential candidate Shirley Chisholm once said, Racism is so universal in this country, so widespread and deep-seated, that it is invisible because it is so normal. Racism has been normalized in the last 20 years in ways that religion has been weaponized to discriminate against racial and religious minority communities. If 2020 wasn't enough for COVID-19 revealing the racial disparities and inequities experienced by communities of color and the working poor in healthcare, education, transportation, and even the ability to earn a livable wage, 2021 has proven to be a year where we all must awaken to a new reality of religious freedom. The events that occurred on January 6th showed and revealed America's worst and, unfortunately, its legacy as a country. Many people said, "This is not the America that I know." Ask a person of color. Ask a religious minority. You might get a different answer. On September the 17th, 1791, 41 of the 55 state delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention to conclude the process of writing the initial blueprint for America's system of governing. They represented different generations and backgrounds, and in their minds, different countries. See, each state was seen as its own independent country. And this, unfortunately, can still be observed today when you look at the inconsistency of public policies and laws that protect some and not others, and then sometimes criminalize others. To that, those states, they pledged their allegiance, and they boldly took issue with the idea of being united. Some of them were wealthy, and others of them came from humble beginnings. But all of them were white men who secretly discussed agendas and ideas that would shape a divided nation. The three main issues that were addressed during this convening were how the president would be elected, the Electoral College, which impacts voting rights and voting issues, the slave trade, which is about human freedom, the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, including the freedom of religion. These were all controversial issues that led to very heated debates by elected state representatives who would become the founding framers. This moment in American history gave birth to the United States Constitution that will become the written supreme law of the land. The Constitution outlined how and who would govern the country. It set a foundation and structure for America's malignant way of functioning. As a consequence, the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness will continue to be a never-ending aspiration for African Americans and people of color in America. Through a historical lens of inquiry, I raised these questions. How is freedom understood by a group of white, mostly slave-owning men whose intentions were to establish a new constitution and a new society by protecting their own interests and property? Is it really possible for freedom and liberation to be fully extended to all when the country's exception was started with exclusion? This is not just a question of establishment, but one of morality and justice. There's a book that's written by Thomas McCullough called The Moral Imagination of Public Life, Raising the Ethical Question. And he presented an argument that challenged the ethics of public policy by raising questions about value systems that are sometimes implemented by politicians, leaders, economists, and individuals that impact how communities are often mishandled. McCullough asserted that textbook ethics are seldom practiced in boiler room situations and posed questions about making tough decisions that may affect one's personal integrity. specifically raising this point. In each situation, how does a person arrive at an intelligent, principled decision with personal integrity? This is where an understanding of morality is important. Morality is understood as a way of life. It involves individual and communal aspects. McCullough suggests that it takes into account embedded practices, beliefs, attitudes, and ways of being in the world. It is beyond a responsibility to oneself, but a community, a larger set of ideas that benefit the greater good of all humanity. And so for the sake of this conversation, when I'm saying community, I'm talking about those who hold us in care and accountable for our actions. So this is why we're convening this evening as a community of activists, scholars, religious and non-religious people who are committed to awakening to a new reality of religious freedom in America, because all of our lives depend on it. As noted in a book about the Constitution by Sarah Levinson, in their book, they wrote that the framers all had different interpretations of justice. We still see that today, where there are different interpretations and understandings around justice. What is justice? To disrupt the narrative about religious freedom in this country, then mandates that we highlight and interrogate the actions of the fragmented founders who willingly use their power and influence. Let's think about this for a moment. What would our country look like today if the 55 delegates and the 54 who considered the words of Governor Morris denounced the slave trade in 1787? What would our country be today if women, racial and religious minorities were active participants at the Philadelphia Convention? I'm not certain of all the details that would have happened, but I would guess that we would probably be in a better place. Awakening to a new reality requires us to examine things that are in our founding documents, such as Article 6 of the US Constitution that clearly outlines that there is no religious test for office and that candidates are only bound to uphold the Constitution. Yet we find that in the court of public opinion, there continues to be this moral dilemma about who has the right to be in America and how one should believe. We see this often around times of elections. But it's important to note that even elections and voting rights are issues that are central to religious freedom concerns. So in 2020, Virginia became the first Southern state to enact a comprehensive non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people, but also they included a piece of legislation, the Virginia Values Act, which extends legal protections of all crucial areas of life for people that might identify as LGBTQ. Now, this is a great victory, especially when you see how far Virginia has come in its history of discriminatory practices against people of color as it pertains to many issues like marriage equality, housing, voting rights, and religious discrimination. I want to pause right there and share a story with you. My uncle, Gary Dent, earlier this year, we had a conversation in talking about voting rights. And he shared with me that my grandfather, who lived in Chesapeake, Virginia, went to vote in 1966. And when he went to vote at the polls, he was then given a polling test. The person working the polls said to my grandfather that in order for him to vote, he had to count the number of jelly beans that were in the jar, or guess the number of jelly beans in the jar. Now, it's important to share with you that my grandfather, following the rule of law in the state of Virginia at the time, had already paid the polling tax to vote, but then he faced another barrier as he went to the polls to exercise his right in this democracy. So it impacts voting rights, but it also impacts us in areas of, like I said, housing, marriage equality, and even racial discrimination. So just to give you a little bit more history about the state of Virginia, on June 12, 1967, the Supreme Court decided the landmark case, Lovin versus Virginia, unanimously ruling that banning interracial marriage was illegal. Richard Lovin, a white man, and his Black and Native American wife, Mildred Lovin, only desired to live their lives peacefully together and raise their children in Caroline County, Virginia. However, their love and union was considered a violation of the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. The act was birthed by white supremacist Walter Plecker, who was a devout Presbyterian, son of a Confederate soldier, and a medical professional who instituted the one-drop rule. Plecker proclaimed that damaging religious beliefs that suggested that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah due to race mixing that occurred. In essence, he upheld white supremacist ideologies that were shaped by pseudoscientific practices of eugenics and his religious beliefs that denied the human dignity of Black and Indigenous people in the United States. The deep implications of Plecker's personal and religious practices manifested in racist ways that impacted his service, get this, as the first registrar of vital statistics at the Virginia Bureau of Vital Statistics. Plecker would be the first person to assign racial identity of a person on a birth certificate from 1912 to 1946. He used his religious beliefs and his ideologies about race to determine how one identifies in the world. In 2021, some may assume that this mix of discrimination and religion is a thing of the past, but many are still harmed by this toxic fusion. The white supremacist practices and ideologies that have propagated whites as a superior race for centuries continue to have grave implications in 2020 in the form of racial bigotry, gender bias, LGBTQ discrimination, and religious privilege, specifically Christian privilege in the United States. A subset of Christian religious leaders with narrow-minded worldviews need to take into account the many historical ways that religion was used to disenfranchise and extort Indigenous and Black communities for their own gain. Black people have consistently had to fight for the rights to be fully recognized in society, even with the penning of the Constitution, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Voting Rights Act. The experience of the Lovins and every racial and religious minority in the United States should serve as a reminder of what happens when racist ideologies and religious supremacy of any kind determine the fate of any group of people. Discrimination promoted under the guise of religious freedom is no exception. It is immoral, unethical, and unacceptable. To reimagine the promises of the Constitution, we must remember that every person has the right to freedom of religion, that is to practice their religious beliefs or to not profess any, according to their own conscience. Religion and religious freedom should never be used as a weapon to cause harm to others or to discriminate. However, in 2020, we continue to see proposed pieces of legislation that undermine voting rights in states by closing houses of worship that have historically served as polling places that serve the surrounding communities. At the same time, we've witnessed where some religious leaders have pushed back on vaccine mandates that prioritize public health and safety by citing their religious beliefs. The separation of religion and government, as outlined in the First Amendment and of the Constitution in these words, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of people to peacefully assemble to petition the government for the redress of grievances. It's important that we remember that the government should not show favoritism or preference towards any religious group, and that people of all religions and none must be treated fairly. This is what the highest law in the land reminds us. There is no place for Christian nationalism in a country that was never founded on Christian principles, and never should be one's identity as an American be tied as such. So in essence, what it means to be American doesn't mean that you have to be Christian or vice versa. That everyone has the right to practice their beliefs according to their own conscience. So in 2021, I strongly believe that faith communities have a responsibility to continue holding our elected officials accountable to their moral obligation to serve we the people. We the people of the United States in 2021 is comprised of religious and non-religious people from beautiful and diverse racial and cultural and ethnic backgrounds who identify by many gender identities and pronouns. Some of our families were brought to America in chains. Other families arrived by choice. And even some out of desperation for a better life, seeking asylum here in our country. We've seen that recently with the Afghan refugees, as well as the Haitian refugees who are seeking safety in this country. We in the United States are over 165.9 million women strong, with voting rights guaranteed by the 19th Amendment. Unlike 1787, we are in the Supreme Court, the Senate, the Congress, and even in the White House with our first elected Black and Asian woman of descent, VP Kamala Harris. We have the right to make choices about healthcare, about our bodies, about reproductive rights, about policies and laws that impact our being. So you might ask, why does all this matter? Well, it matters because to be a leader, a faith leader in the 21st century, does not require that you are perfect, but willing to take risks to ensure the freedom and human dignity of every person. This is how we address the moral imperative of freedom in this country. We cannot unsee the cries for humanity around the world in the wake of the tragic deaths of so many people of color, including our trans brothers and sisters like Dominique Remy Fels, a Black trans woman who was murdered last year, and many more to name throughout the public proclamations that Black Lives Matter. With this inclusive approach, the vested stakeholders must pledge a commitment to addressing systemic change in policies and political systems. That's on a local level, a state level, regionally, and nationally. And for those that might be watching, even globally. So friends, this lecture, it served as an invitation for all of us to interrogate the ways in which religion and religious freedom have been weaponized across time, laws, disciplines, and public policies. The examples that I shared invite us to reimagine conversations about innocent children who are victims of racially motivated terrorism that impacts their liberation, existence, survival, and religious identities, who are separated from their families in courtrooms, and sometimes even, as we've seen, at the borders. If we believe that religious freedom is a constitutional and human right for people of all religions and none, then we must awaken to a new reality and take the necessary action steps to address an administration who made promises of prioritizing religious freedom, by which they did end the ban against Muslim majority countries and African nations. But we must help them to see how religion continues to be used to disenfranchise public education by supporting private school voucher programs that do not support the greater good of all of our children, no matter how they show up in life. We must be proactive about petitioning our elected leaders about issues that matter to us. If we believe that religious freedom is a constitutional and human right for all, then we must make every effort to educate ourselves about the issues, engage in dialogue with one another, and seek understanding about our perspectives, our experiences, and take action. You will have the opportunity this week to hear from many speakers that come from many different perspectives. We have people that work in environmental justice, such as Kendall Crawley Crawford, who is with Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, working on environmental justice issues and water justice. We have people like Dr. Takesha Dwan Everett, who is with Health Equity Solutions, addressing healthcare disparities that impact so many communities of color, especially our children. We'll also be joined by elected officials, such as Representative Padma Kupa, who is the first Indian immigrant and Hindu American to serve in the Michigan State Legislature, who has prioritized education as part of her priorities and platform for this year. There are so many voices that you will hear from. There are so many scholars and religious leaders that are on the ground that are taking action in many different ways. But you also will have the opportunity on Saturday to participate in an advocacy training hosted by our friends at the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, the BJC. They'll tell us more about the work that they're doing in saving the sacred native lands of Indigenous communities through the campaign Save Oak Flat. Overall, friends, it is the responsibility of religious leaders and free thinkers of a moral conscience to be intentional about our efforts to include all voices in this discussion about religious freedom. We must be compassionate listeners who are willing to take risks to advocate for those who are challenged by privilege and sit on the margins of life. And we must collaborate with others who are already doing this work. In closing, I want to share one story with you about why it's important for faith communities to engage in advocacy work. Earlier this year, I participated in a National Day of Action that was hosted by Americans United, where we participated in virtual lobby visits with our congressional representatives and senators' offices to discuss an important piece of legislation, specifically the Do No Harm Act. For those that aren't familiar with it, the Do No Harm Act was introduced in the US Senate this year on September the 15th by Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey. The Do No Harm Act is a piece of legislation that clarifies that religious freedom should never be used to inflict harm on other people. Although the Religious Freedom Restoration Act has been used many times by religious groups to bypass federal protections designed to protect the most vulnerable populations, including children and child labor and abuse, as well as equal employment and non-discrimination, as well as healthcare and federal contracts and grants and many other government services. The Do No Harm Act ensures that religious freedom is used as a shield to protect the constitutional right to free exercise of religion and not a sword to discriminate. So to get back to my story, toward the end of the visit with the elected official, we made the ask of the aide to support this piece of legislation. To which the response was, if the bill was already on the floor, they would have already voted in support of it. For me, moral leadership in this country requires that proactive leadership that embodies care and compassion for all. Centuries of poor decisions in the best interests of the 1% have left blood on the many hands and streets of people in communities of color and in impoverished communities. So I challenge you. I'm challenging myself. Over the next 2 days, I want all of us to think about the critical role that we play in disrupting narratives about religious freedom that have not served all Americans or people well. We need to reimagine the role of religion and how we engage in our communities, in the public square, and in shaping public policies that prioritize the fullness of our humanity in areas of environmental justice, healthcare, reproductive freedom, and voting rights. Friends, this work requires all of us to take action. So, in the words of Ida B. Wells, I end with this reminder. The only way to right wrongs is to shine the light of truth upon them. I invite you to be an active participant over the next couple of days of this Reimagining Religious Freedom Conference. I invite you to take good notes and have a healthy sense of curiosity. And we will do this work together. And so shall it be. Thank you.